Welcome to Last American Vagabond. Thank you for joining me today. I've got a returning guest here to discuss a very important topic, something that I feel is especially relevant to what we're dealing with today. And this is a topic that we've spoken on in the past. Returning guest David Meiswinkle, who is the President Executive Director for the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And this is discussing the Anthrax story. And we've gone into this quite a bit in the past, but he's here to discuss some new developments on this story. So thank you so much for joining today, David.
Thank you, Ryan, for having me here.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you. I mean, this is the kind of information, despite being so incredibly relevant and going through legal processes that just do not get discussed by the mainstream media, which is really staggering because of how important this is. And again, to reiterate that I think this story really, and David and I were kind of talking about this beforehand, this is something that if the fact that it wasn't dealt with properly, that it was ultimately seemingly covered up, I feel strongly that that is why we're dealing with what we're dealing with today in regard to COVID-19 and a lot of other things. So let's start off today by basically talking about what we went over, or kind of starting where we went from in the past. We went over this in our past interview, but can you start off by briefly kind of explaining the process that you're undertaking right now and why ultimately why you're going through this process, you know, a redress for government misconduct?
Right. As you know, that the Lawyers Committee is dedicated to transparency and accountability, reference the government in the investigations of 9/11, the crimes of 9/11. And we've done things in New York City. We have a litigation going on right now, reference the World Trade Center towers, and that they were brought down by controlled demolition. We're trying to get that evidence into the court, and we're in a lawsuit right now. We're in a lawsuit now, too, down in Washington, D.C. on the 9/11 Review Commission. And the first lawsuit is against the U.S. Attorney. The second is against the FBI. This is a petition we just filed a few weeks ago with Congress, and it asks to reopen the Anthrax investigation because we've done an investigation on our own for the last 8 months. We have a Anthrax committee. It's comprised of 4 attorneys, a number of professional investigators, a doctor who is basically very familiar with anthrax, and another doctor from the university. So we have been looking at this situation, and we've given Congress now 435 of the representatives in the House and 100 senators, I believe, U.S. senators, the executive summary, which is a 3-page summary, which outlines what our findings are, and a 76-page petition along with 69 documents. Some of the documents have never been seen before. Basically, what we're saying is that Bruce Ivins, he's the individual that eventually was fingered as the lone wolf suspect, that he committed these attacks. That's the government saying that he did not do that, that he was incapable of doing that for a number of reasons, that he was scapegoated, and that the evidence, if it was ever put at a trial, would have showed that he was not guilty of committing those crimes, and that the people or the institutions, organizations most responsible for that anthrax attacks, which included the killing of 5 people, the injuring of 17, an assassination attempt on 2 U.S. senators, that those individuals, those organizations, which were the likely suspects, were never looked at. We're also asking Congress to get involved because we don't believe the Department of Justice can really investigate this. It can't investigate, the FBI can't investigate itself. So we need a special counsel to get involved there. And just to highlight, too, what was going on back then, 9/11 had just happened. Within a week of 9/11, on approximately September 18th, letters were sent out allegedly from Princeton, New Jersey, and they were sent to Tom Brokaw, CBS News, New York Post, NBC, ABC, and then another batch of letters was sent out a few weeks later, and this was during the time when the Patriot Act was being pushed, and it's a time when basically I believe it was Tom Daxel or Patrick Leahy, both of them, were told by Dick Cheney that he wanted it approved by October 5th. Wasn't approved by October 5th. On October 9th, however, anthrax attack was launched on both Leahy and Daxel, and on October 15th, Daxel's one of the people in his office opened a letter and was contaminated. Meanwhile, a fellow named Robert Stevens, who worked for American Media down in Florida, in Boca, Florida, he died from anthrax. There was apparently a letter sent down there during that period of time that alerted everyone October 5th when he died that there was really an anthrax attack going on. So
Yeah.
that basically bring you up to speed a little bit. There's a lot in between, a lot that happens then after.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in this story for sure, and it's still up in the air as far as I'm concerned. But it's important to add to that I think we touched on last time is that these were two people specifically that were, dragging their feet in regard to the Patriot Act, and that's ultimately some of the theorizing ideas here is that that ultimately after that it was seemingly no problems. I mean, that's a lot more to that story as well, but that's ultimately the way it panned out. And so you have to wonder whether or not as this continues to kind of materialize into something that seems far more fishy than that should have been, as far more fishy than many other things we could point to, we should be asking the question of whether there was some nefarious characters here in regard to trying to pass something that they would otherwise not be able to pass. That's something that has historical precedent in this country. But I'd like to start first with the petition discussion, because you talked last time and in just this whole story about how evidence and previous efforts by your group and others, it's just showing us that the FBI was seemingly purposefully dragging their feet, covering up facts around the case. So how difficult was it just to get this petition in front of people that need to see it?
Well, what it takes is a lot of work to do the investigation and to try to pull all the pieces together. One of the key things we did, we talked to some of the people, including Richard Lambert, for 3.5 hours. Now, Richard Lambert was the head of the investigation, the FBI. He was the inspector in charge for 4 years. And he left there and he wrote basically a critique, 2,000-page critique. He's very upset, and because he was being obstructed himself within his own agency. And it's in the 2,000 pages, 16 of those pages had to do with Bruce Ivins and the exculpatory evidence associated with him, because he was a little bit upset they were trying to finger him at that time. So we talked to him, and he advised us, if you want to get a hold of this document, you'll probably have to go to Congress to get a hold of that document. Now, we also made good incursions into USEMRID at the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. That's Fort Detrick. Now, Fort Detrick, normally you say, oh my gosh, Fort Detrick, that's, you get a lot of negative vibes of people have in the past. In this regard, what we found out that Fort Detrick was actually being victimized, that their scientists were being looked at in a way that, see, at Fort Detrick, they didn't make this type of powdered anthrax, highly sophisticated anthrax. They concentrated on liquid anthrax. So they didn't have the equipment or the knowledge to do it, and the FBI knows that.
Since you brought it up, I was going to ask you in regard to the Dugway, I think it was the Dugway Proving Grounds, in regard to where they tested these things. So you mentioned that in the petition in regard to what you're discussing there, that ultimately it showed that, and there's people that are testifying to this, that ultimately they didn't have the ability to do so, right? And in regard to where it ultimately came from. And so you're saying ultimately that they used Fort Detrick as a way to essentially frame the location and the individual there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, we're saying that certainly. What happens near the beginning, the FBI get involved, they get an assessment of the material. Now, this anthrax that Tom Daxel got, no one had ever seen it like anything like it in this country. On 1 gram of this anthrax was 1 trillion spores. So let that sink in, how fine this was. Under the microscope, they were all clumped together. There was no space in between. Normally, when it's not a pure and refined, there's like debris, like waste product and stuff there that scientists will see, under microscopes, and when they blow it up. On this, it was totally packed. They had not seen anything like it. And it was so fine that it was energized so that it was almost like a gas. So that's particularly lethal, because there's 3 types of anthrax. Inhalation is the worst. There's cutaneous, where it touches you and you get a black lesion, and there's digestive anthrax. But this was by far the worst. So if you've got a little of it in your lungs, you're in trouble unless you get an antidote right away. So basically, what Daxel got and what Leahy got was this super weaponized anthrax. And that was what, when Battelle came in to look at it on behalf of the request by the FBI, they were playing it down. They were saying this is 10 to 50 times less powerful than what the Army's saying. And the Army officer he's going bonkers and saying, what are you talking about? He says, you took this stuff and you autoclaved it. You turned it into hockey pucks. In other words, they distorted the evidence to analyze the evidence and came back and said that this stuff's no big deal. Now, there was two types of anthrax that came. There was a browner, cruder. It was a more granular anthrax, the first launching that went to Brokaw in the New York Post and the media, which would kill you, or could kill you, certainly. But this anthrax, the second launching, was super weaponized. So it seems like there was basically two preparations at least there to send it out.
And you had mentioned in this the discussion of, well, actually, before I even get to that, I wanted to ask you a question in regard to the bioweapon aspect of this. So first of all, it's quite clear that even in their own research, or whatever the story, that the narrative that's being painted, that it came from Fort Detrick, as we're being told, but that in itself means it came from the U.S. government. So this is a weaponized version of anthrax. I mean, it wasn't really a secret, but we know that it's very clear that they're working on weapons, and not just weapons with the direction of trying to reach vaccines. I just think that's an important thing to bring up.
Here's the thing, now, within the reference in that time frame, they weren't supposed to be doing anything offensively with anthrax. There was a bioweapons treaty that was actually authored by Francis Boyle, as an attorney out of the University of Chicago and a friend of the Lawyers Committee. And what apparently was happening, and Battelle wasn't being upfront at that time, neither was the FBI. They were working on three projects with the CIA having to do with anthrax. One was called Clear Vision, one was called the Bacchus, and one was called Jefferson. And in order to do those projects, and of course they were secret projects, or top secret projects, it seems like they had to convert some of this anthrax into weaponized anthrax, or an offensive anthrax. And that was supposedly having to do something with the Soviets at that time, had amazing capabilities to produce and were producing their own bioweapons in smallpox and anthrax and things of that nature. So there was a scientist that worked at Fort's at USEMRID named Richard Sperzel, and he was one of the world's experts. And he said Ivans, of course, couldn't do that. He didn't have the knowledge. He says there's only 4 or 5 people in the United States that could do that, and I'm one of them. So then you look at maybe William Patrick, who was basically the father of the bioweapons industry. Perhaps he could have done it. Ken Alabek, who was a Russian defector, a very high level, who was working, I believe, in Battelle. Perhaps he could have done it. And then that leaves only a few more possibilities, right? Now, the key thing here was, and what they were trying to do is say that Fort Detrick was involved, and in particular, Bruce Ivans. Now, this has come about right away. Their initial attacks were on Al-Qaeda and Iraq. Right when 9/11 went down, the articles were all talking about, the newspapers, about the involvement of Iraq and through Al-Qaeda, etc. And eventually this was basically undermined, because through analysis, apparently a professor or scientist, Paul Keim, at Northern University in Arizona, Northern Arizona University, he detected it, as he was an expert, as Ames anthrax. Ames is an American weapons strain. That's ours. That's our baby. And the bentonite, which would be in Iraq's anthrax, it wasn't there. What was there was silicone. And silicone was used to probably, along with tin, to make it really refined and dispersible, making an aerolization, so to speak. So what happens initially, they blame 2 fellows who were working in Pennsylvania. I think the guys were just on a green card, but they had good jobs with the city. I think it might have been, I'm trying to think, somewhere in Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. And they put a lot of pressure on them. They lost their jobs. They weren't the guy. Then they went after a doctor in New York who he wasn't the fellow either. It put a lot of pressure on him, and I read that he lost his marriage because of it. Then they went after a guy named Perry Meiswinkle, and this is important because Meiswinkle used to work at Fort Detrick, and he was working at Patel, and they put a lot of pressure on this fellow, and he starts drinking, and he has a liver problem to begin with, and then all of a sudden he dies from supposedly from the alcohol problem. Now, Meiswinkle had been talking to Ivins. They knew each other because they used to work together at one time. And then they went after Stephen Hatfield, who was also from Fort Detrick, and they hound dogged him from 2002 to probably about 2007. And he turned the tables on him. He started drinking too, and he started, getting sickly and things of that nature. And you have to imagine the constant pressure on you 24/7 when they start watching you. And then he turned the tables, and after they made a circus with search warrants going into his house with the media there recording it all live. Here we go. And Stephen Hatfield, as the Anthrax, a person of interest, is saying Ashcroft, and he turns it around, sues them, and wins over $5 million. Then they go after Ivins, and they connect Ivins because at that time this DNA sequencing had been developed to a flask in his supposedly under his care. It's called RMR 1029, and RMR 1029 supposedly has these morphs. There's 4 morphs that are variations or mutants, and they appear in that the attack letter Anthrax and supposedly in his flask. And that's where it gets kind of interesting, because eventually the National Academy of Science looks at the work that was done, and the government operation, government operation, I forget the name of the organization now, GEO, and they both say that there's not conclusive evidence that the morphs that were in that vial and that Ivins caused the attacks. So
it's incredible to see that the breakdown of literally everything they're using to make this go a certain way. I mean, it's incredible that prior to Ivins, numerous arrests or investigations or interrogations that lead to nothing, that ultimately, as you're pointing out, ruin people's lives. And then finally it gets to Ivins, who, as you're saying, we're now finding out after the fact, which is what arguably what the FBI should have been doing, probably didn't care, is that he didn't have the capability to do the thing that they're saying he was capable of, right? And then on top of all of that, the flask that they're using, which is a huge centerpiece in this whole thing, we're finding out now doesn't actually trace back in the way that they say it does.
Here's the way it is. The other agency was the Government Accountability Office that I didn't remember. But this is the key thing with these. What they don't tell the government is that the flask that Ivins has, 85% of that came from Dugway. And it came from Dugway on many production runs. And the other 15% was put in there from another flask that he kept, his own personal flask, 1030. And that was tested by the FBI. That had none of the morphs in. So all the morphs had to come from Dugway. But what happens eventually, the FBI calls in all the Ames anthrax strains, any samples that laboratories have in the country. They get tested over 1,070 samples, and they get 8 positives. One is the anthrax morphs that are supposedly in Ivins 1029, and also there's one having to do with Patel. So Patel had the 4 morphs. What they don't tell the government, or what they don't tell Congress, is that Dugway was the source of the morphs.
So what is that ultimately in regard to Dugway versus Fort Detrick, right? In regard to the narrative of Detrick and Ivins, it coming from Dugway, what's the relevance of that for the average person?
Well, it coming from Dugway is that when Dugway's supposed to also give their Ames strain to the FBI, and they apparently, because what they're supposed to do is supposed to grow it themselves then give it to the FBI, who then regrows it, or they have an agency that regrow it. And what happens is that somewhere down the line, all of the Dugway samples are non-viable, which means they're not alive. Somebody killed them. And the FBI protocol is that they have to be viable. So if they're non-viable, they can't be tested, or they don't test them. They could be tested. All right, they still could be. They could test it, and they might be able to find the morphs if they're there. But the protocol wasn't to test it if it was non-viable. So Dugway gets away from having to produce or pony up their Ames strain, and in particular the Ames strain that was going into the flasks. So it looks like Ivins is holding the flask. Now they're saying that he had it totally in his control, but that's not true. And there's documents to indicate that they had, for the most part, or for a good part of the time, they were in an area that was accessible by just about anyone that could get into those buildings. And he was in a totally different building. Later on, he's basically made the custodian of it, I think in 2004. But for years, that's not the case. For years, that anyone at Fort Detrick that had access to get in there could have. So there's hundreds of people. And then when you talk about the Dugway situation, they had hundreds of people too. And then if you bring in Battelle, that could be hundreds of people. So all of a sudden you open up the possibility of people from supposedly this lone wolf who has total access to the anthrax, which isn't true, to the morph anthrax, where you have hundreds of people have access to it, and he doesn't even have it in, he didn't even get it initially. It was Dugway who sent it to him. Now what they did is they made a big deal out of the first time. He may have been ahead of the curve in a little bit to send them samples, and they rejected his sample because they said he didn't have the proper slats or the proper medium it wasn't grown in. But but what their protocol was to give this Paul Keim because everybody's supposed to submit 2 samples, so the other sample went to Keim. So the FBI, the initial sample, which they're knocking him down on, they destroyed, but Keim kept his sample, and in his sample, the morphs were there. All right, so it shows that he wasn't trying to hide anything from them. The second sample he gave, they said didn't have the morphs. Now that's possible because he may not have understood the instructions, but also you could take what they call a pinprick, where you take a colony of it just really closely, and they may not have it. Versus I think the subpoena was saying do a loop gathering, which is, I guess, a whole conglomerate of the mix. So that's basically what they were trying to make a big deal out of that. But he did initially, and I was told later on by other scientists a number of times, give him good samples. It's just that one time they destroyed the sample before they looked at it, and Paul Keim actually kept it. So it wasn't incriminating whatsoever. It's just that anything he did, even when he passed a lie detector test, they had a reason to try and spin it to say he must have mastered how to pass a lie detector test. They were really out to get him. That's what it seemed like.
Yeah, and this is what all this is seeming like to me, or the story you're painting here, the facts that you're showing us, is that the FBI at every step of this is actively, this is malfeasance. I mean, they're clearly doing the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing. And even to this day, there's plenty of the parts of all the stuff that you're presenting that nobody could argue that the stuff in the petition, the different exhibits, these are all very obviously relevant aspects to this story, relevant aspects to any detective or any researcher. It's very, very clear.
What's really interesting, Ryan, is that what the FBI was saying is these were the fingerprints, the morphs. They're not the fingerprints at all. There are fingerprints, but they didn't examine the fingerprints. One is B subtilis. B subtilis is a simulant that accompanies, it's used, in other words, to pretend that we're using anthrax. Say we want to do an exercise to test the explosives with a tank or something like that. We're not going to use the real anthrax. We're going to use something that's very similar to it. So we use the B subtilis. It doesn't necessarily kill you, So, but the Dugway was very familiar, and they use it all the time. And in fact, the runs, the production runs that Ivins was given, the 19 production runs to start filling up the flask he had, the 1,000 milliliter flask from Dugway, at least 5 of those runs were totally contaminated, they had to destroy them because they had B subtilis. And a number of the other runs had B subtilis, and they would dilute it and then eventually send him this leader, this anthrax. Now, Ivans used this because they were experimenting with on animals for vaccines, so they needed the anthrax to inoculate the animals. So the B subtilis was something that was characteristic of all the investigation we've done thus far with Dugway. Now, the significance is that B subtilis was found in the first batch of letters that went to Tom Brokaw and went to New York Post and the various media. So the B subtilis was a fingerprint, which the FBI, just happens not to concentrate on. In addition, in another fingerprint had to do with the silicone, because the silicone and the B subtilis was not in with the magic morphs, with these 4 morphs that were in this flask that Ivans had. They were not there. All right. In other words, apparently they were added later to it. If the morphs were there, and we don't even know where originally it came from, because originally it came from Dugway. So you can't say it came from Fort Detrick.
It gives the impression of evidence tampering, is what it sounds like.
Well, definitely, and selective investigation.
Right.
What happens with the silicon, they find, in addition to silicone, tin, which the FBI doesn't like to talk about the tin either. Now, the tin is a catalyst for the silicon. It's this microencapsulation, which brings the silicon into the exposorium. It's inside the anthrax, so it's very sophisticated. In past, the silicon would be on the outside, but this makes it really dispersible. When you have to think of these a trillion spores, think of them almost like glass beads, like invisible glass beads. What they've done is they've taken the electric charges or removed it, so it doesn't clump together. So everything is just energized, it's moving. In fact, when they try to look under a microscope, it moves off the plate. When they look at it in a test tube, it's crawling up the test tube. It wants to get out, it's energized, it's moving, and they've never seen anything like that. But what happens is the FBI plays that down. They want to look at it more or less as this crude stuff. We'll lock it into these 4 mystical morphs and then end it there. So right there is when it should have begun, and it should have went to the B subtilis. Now, who has B subtilis? Well, Dugway has B subtilis. And who has the aerolization with the tin and the silicone and the iron and oxygen, which was found in it too? Well, Battelle has that. Now, what they don't tell you is necessarily Battelle and Dugway have a joint area in Dugway where they work together. So that's where the investigation should have went to the next stage. And now you're talking about high-grade weapons anthrax, and it's something that the Army detected right away, and which Battelle was trying to play down along with the FBI playing it down.
Yeah, I think, and to go to one of the things that's in your exhibits, this is, I think, right on exactly why what it sounds like you're describing is that the idea was to make it appear as if this was something that could have been executed by somebody in Al-Qaeda, right? As opposed to an expert. So that's why it seems that, like, I would take off what you were saying there. Let me just read this real quick and then you can comment on it. And this again is here is the list of the exhibits. I should show you my other points I was going to show. These are all the exhibits that are shared in this petition. I recommend, and this will all be included in the show notes, I recommend you all take the time to look through this stuff because it is incredible. And you'll realize very quickly that this is stuff that can't just be dismissed. But now here, this is from 2008, August 2nd. It says, in the immediate aftermath of the 2001 anthrax attacks, the White House officials repeatedly pressed FBI Director Robert Mueller, which I find very relevant, to prove it was a second wave assault by Al-Qaeda. But investigators ruled that out. Of course, this is talking about a second wave in regard to 9/11, because these things are very connected. After October 5, 2001, death from anthrax exposure of Sun photo editor Robert Stevens, Mueller was beaten up, it says, during President Bush's morning intelligence briefings for not producing proof that the killer spores were of the handiwork of terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden, who, remember, was previously in the past somebody who worked with the U.S. government. They really wanted to blame somebody in the Middle East, it said. Retired senior FBI official told the news. Now, this is important. It says, but by then, the FBI already knew anthrax spilling out of letters addressed to the media outlets and to U.S. Senator was a military strain of the bioweapon. It says, very quickly, Fort Detrick experts told us that This was not something some guy in a cave could come up with. And they couldn't go from box cutters one week and weapons grade anthrax to the next. Now, it seems quite clear to me that was something they were trying to push. And the idea was that if they went on the stuff that you're talking about, the evidence that was there, it challenges that narrative. Now, what are your thoughts?
Well, what happens is no, I think certainly they were, and they didn't get away with it at that time, but they did, in a sense, get away with it because they pushed the narrative to the extent. What happens with Bruce Ivins is he commits suicide allegedly. Now, we've talked to two people very close to him and said they think he was murdered. He was under 24/7 surveillance. And he did have some mental health issues before all this began, so this sort of exasperated it, and they blew his private life out and embarrassed him terribly. They embarrassed him at work, and they basically set him up to drinking. He became drinking too, just like Perry Mikesell did, just like Stephen Hatfield did, and eventually he supposedly overdoses with Tylenol. There's never an autopsy done on his body. And and so right then and there, the FBI basically concludes the investigation and says that he's the killer, and a number of people, in particular, for the scientists that we have in our made declarations there in the exhibits, and two of them are colonels, one's a lieutenant colonel, and they knew Ivins very well. They worked with him, and they put their reputation on the line that he didn't do that. And they also would direct the attention to some of the agencies that I just mentioned before. Now, what's interesting is Congressman Nadler and Rush Holt wanted an investigation at that time, and also that Patrick Leahy and Senator Grassley weren't content either with what happened. But I want to read you that there's one of the exhibits, and there's a just to show you that the thinking of the FBI is so convoluted. Nadler's asking about basically Dugway and Battelle, because it was known then that they had the capabilities to do it, but nobody was looking at it. And
very similar to what we're dealing with today. Just want to point that out.
Then Mueller says something like, using various methods, the FBI investigated the two facilities that received samples from the parent flask. Now that's from Ivins Flask 1029. And it eliminated individuals from those facilities as suspects because even if a laboratory facility had the equipment and personnel to make anthrax powder, this powder would not match the spores in the mailed envelopes if that lab had never received a transfer of anthrax from the parent flask. So basically what he's saying is that they received it and then they didn't receive it. I mean, he's saying the same thing. They would be suspects if they received the flask, but they didn't receive any of the stuff from the flask because they received stuff from the flask. It makes absolutely no sense. It's a convoluted thinking. I've never seen anything like that before.
Yeah.
That's their explanation to the congressman, to Congress, as far as why they didn't look at Dugway and Battelle. So what we've done now, we're working still on a grand jury petition. This is a petition to Congress to basically to get them involved in independent investigation. We're going to be doing, and we're well into a petition to the U.S. Attorney, and we'll be breaking down the laws that were violated, and we'll be expanding this a little bit because we didn't cover everything in here that we want to cover and present to Congress and to the U.S. Attorney. So that's where we stand right now. As I said, that and as you mentioned at the beginning, had this been looked at properly at the beginning of the investigation, we may not be dealing with some of the stuff that we are dealing with today. But the government did not do their job, and the FBI didn't do their job. And we say they basically corrupted and obstructed the investigation. And we believe the evidence that we have here says that. And we believe basically their own inspector, Rick Lambert, who was in charge of the investigation for 4 years, is saying the same thing. So we would like to have Congress look at this impartially, objectively, and thoroughly to take it to the next step.
Yeah, I'm sure we could all agree that we would like the FBI and Congress to, do their jobs. That would be fantastic to see. I want just to wrap it up here. I think, the idea of mental issues is something that continues to be a scapegoat, right? And the idea that it can be, I mean, even in regard to foreign policy, I want to point this out, like the idea that, say, Assad just wants to, in Syria, wants to just gas people because he wants to do it. No, don't try to find logic to it. Don't realize that what he does actually is detrimental to their agendas. It's only because he's a madman. And that's kind of this way that they go, the way that they lean into these things. So with Ivins, it's not that he has any motive or that there's any benefit to what he's doing. It's because he had mental issues. And this seems like a common thread in the bad guy boogeyman stories, the narratives by the, not just the U.S. government, but in this case, the U.S. government. And that's just very frustrating to see because, as you said, and I was just a quick reference this on the way out, there's numerous examples, and there's one that you shared here that this was Dr. Jeffrey Adamovich, I believe. And this is just a very, very high credentialed person that is openly saying that he strongly believes that Bruce Ivins was not the person behind any of this. And then he goes on to discuss why. And there's a lot of this out there. So the point is that nobody's actually doing the due diligence, and they're just kind of nailing this in. And I just cannot ignore how very clearly that aligns with what we're dealing with today. No due diligence, no investigation. China did it, China bad guy. And it does, at the end of the day, the point is we don't know on either side. And that's what we want to find out here. And that's why hopefully this can continue. This petition was actually submitted on October, I believe the date, I didn't have it in front of me right now, October 15th.
October 15th, yeah. Right. And that's the day that actually Tom Daxel got the petition, or got the Anthrax letter in his office. So we did that symbolically, I think, to commemorate that time.
Yeah.
But no, you're right that the problem is that you have the wrong people doing the investigations. You have the wrong people at the top of these organizations. The organizations aren't set up for integrity. They're set up to protect people or protect interests, it seems like. So we continue to get in a mess, and now we investigate it. What's it? 20 years later, you can go back to the Kennedy assassination. Still, people want an investigation on that. How many years is that? And it's the same pattern we run around in, like going around in a circle. We need to really break out of it. And what's happening in the country today is it may be something that's symptomatic of all that, trying to break out of and take it to a new level with these investigations and these unfortunately corrupt organizations that work for us, work for the government. So again, we believe that Ivins would have never been found guilty in the court of law, and that unfortunately he died unnecessarily. His family was victimized, and that the killers are still loose or never been prosecuted.
Yeah, the sad reality is that, historically speaking anyway, it may end up being what you're doing and the excellent work that you're doing and the group that you're working with, that may ultimately be the amount of the truth that we get. Historically speaking, that's the same idea with JFK or with 9/11, that we get to the point where people like you are saying, here's some evidence, it completely changes the story, and it just gets ignored. And that's the sad reality. And I think that's what we need to see as the American people, as the world, humans in the planet, need to realize that governments out there are actively trying to undermine truth efforts by individuals within their countries. And I think that's classic. That's always been there. So what we need to realize is that we need to mobilize as people, not as Democrats, not as Republicans, not as anything other than individuals that care about the truth, and stand behind people like David Meiswinkle and people that are out there risking themselves to bring that truth to you. And hopefully may one day fight to change the idea that government can keep that from ever coming to light. So thank you so much for being here, David. I want to ask you one more question before you go, is ultimately, where do you see this going? I mean, your opinion based on how it's already gone. What's your prediction on what will happen with this petition?
I think we have to make more connections with the Congress people. We've talked to Rush Holt, and I've called the various offices earlier on to tell them what we were doing. We hadn't done it. We thought that there was so much material there, we'll give them a little bit of time to digest it, and then we'll follow it up. There was HR 720, which was the bill that Holt and Nadler was sponsoring at that time. Nadler's still in office. Leahy's still in office. Russ Grassley is still in office. They all wanted to have an investigation, and there's no reason why there shouldn't be. Now, in the climate today, as Francis Boyle says, he thinks that of course, that was a bioweapons attack, the Anthrax, and he takes it up to today to the COVID, and says that that's a bioweapon too. So you can have a reasonable argument to say, as we said before, had you stopped this at that time and did a proper investigation, held people accountable and agencies accountable, maybe you wouldn't have the controversy we have today as to what is COVID and what's the purpose of that. Now, I know that's a number of shows for you to get into that subject matter, but basically that's what we are, where we are in a sense. The same people that were involved in the anthrax with the dark winter were the same people that were involved in the Crimson Contagion, writing the scripts, etc., in the various agencies. So you have the similar people basically resurfacing during this period of time that were prominent at that time, and doing exercises that really simulated what was really going to be happening in real time. So again, when you deal with exercises, and we're familiar with that, for example, in 9/11, when you had all these military exercises, some of them simulating what was really happening. So you had your air traffic controller saying, is this real time or is this part of the exercise? You know, what's going on here? Very confusing. Anyway, that's what we are. We're very confused, and we're supposed to be confused. That's part of the what the intention is to confuse the public.
I couldn't agree more. And that's a great point to end on there, David. I think that what we can see is from Anthrax, even before, but from that story from 9/11 to today, this is the building of this biosecurity state, or as Whitney would call it, the tri-national security state. And that's what has been being built with this scaremongering. Go ahead.
What's very dangerous too is what Boyle has pointed out, is that this led to a proliferation of these little laboratories all over the country dealing with the bioweapons or biotechnology and splicing genes and doing DNA, what kinds of weird experiments that we haven't the slightest idea what they're doing. So again, coming up to present day, as far as what the episode with Wuhan, essentially with the COVID, what that's all about, that as I said, maybe it would have been prevented if this had been properly investigated. So we have to really investigate that too, as we go forward. Everything that's unfortunately, the government should be doing these investigations, and we should, as the people, say, "Oh, good, I feel good about it." But who feels good about it? Nobody feels good about it, unfortunately, when the government gets to investigate itself, basically.
Yeah, and that's so true. I mean, you made a great point right there. That it's the government should be doing this, but it's the people that are doing this right now while they actively step on all the things that the people are trying to accomplish. Whether you're talking about Assange or what you guys are working on, or any other entity out there that's fighting to expose truth. It seems like at every turn, the government is actively trying to stop that from happening.
And it's the same with what you're doing and other platforms similar to yours, is that you're doing what the legitimate, the quote illegitimate. You're the legitimate now. You guys have become the legitimate media, but what the so-called ABC, NBC, Fox, CBS, and all those news broadcasters should be doing, instead of parroting what they've been told to do. You guys are doing independent journalism. You're opening it up, creating the dialogue, and if there's any opportunity for freedom, it's from you keeping the airways free as much as you can. So we're all indebted to you, and we appreciate that.
Well, thank you, David. That means quite a bit to me. I appreciate that. Well, to end it here, I think the idea that the same people popping up is a very great point to think about, that the same people and the same events and the same cover-ups of the past are resurfacing today. And I think that paints the exact picture that we're trying to leave people with, that unless we do something about it, the same people will do the same thing. So thank you so much for being here, David. And any other things you want to leave us with before we go, social media links or anything like that?
Well, yeah, just that what we want to do, the Lawyers Committee, we would love to have a giant FOIA campaign. It's freedom of information. In order to do that, though, we could create an incredible library of documents which we make public. We're also looking at a new grand jury petition, government obstruction and misconduct, which would cover all the crimes of 9/11, which would be an amazing. And we've had amazing feat if we could pull that off and connect. We want to connect all the dots. We're not done with this. We haven't even gotten to Shanksville or the Pentagon, right? We're at Anthrax. We started with the twin towers, etc., the World Trade Center. So, like all organizations, we need finances to continue. We're badly need finances to continue at a high level, or even at least at the level we're doing right now. So if people would like to support the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, you can at lc4for911.org. It's lc4for911.org, and your finances, your funds, or your donations will go to a good cause for sure. We'll do the best we can to get behind these crimes and try to take them into the courts, try to take them before grand juries, and try to get some action. And as you said, maybe this is the most that'll ever be done. At least we'll document the crimes, and people then in the future can look back and look at the material and understand the history.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, instead of going out there and spending money on GoFundMe's for politicians that are being attacked by other politicians, how about we fund something like this that's actually seeking out truth? I recommend you do. Of course, all this will be included in the show notes below, so if you choose to do so, it'll be there for you. Thank you, David, for being here. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.